I still can't shake the image from my mind. A boy, barely a teenager, lying motionless on the cold, damp ground. The dim yellow glow of a nearby street lamp flickered, casting long, eerie shadows against the brick walls of the narrow alley. The pavement beneath him was slick not from rain, but from the blood slowly pooling beneath his small frame. 14-year-old John was dying. His shirt was soaked, clinging to his body, revealing the crimson stains spreading from two deep stab wounds, one in his chest, another in his stomach. His breathing was shallow, each gasp a struggle. His lips trembled, his fingers twitching ever so slightly, as if he were reaching for something or someone. And then, just a few feet away, Mark stood frozen. His hands, still clutching the bloodied knife, shook violently. His eyes were wide, staring at the mess before him. His best friend, his only real friend, lay crumpled at his feet, barely clinging to life. His own hands, his shirt, even his face streaked with John's blood. But here's the part that made no sense. John had asked for this. No struggle, no screams, no attempts to run. He had stood still. He had let it happen. And now, as sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer by the second, Mark did the only thing he could think of. He made up a lie. When the first paramedics rushed onto the scene, Mark was still there standing over John's barely breathing body. His face was pale, his entire body trembling. The blood on his hands had begun to dry, darkening in the cold night air. He was still in shock, unable to move, his breath short and erratic. "Who did this?" one of the paramedics asked, kneeling beside John, pressing down on his chest to slow the bleeding. Mark's response came out stammered, barely above a whisper. It was a man in black. He ran off. Sound. A brief silence, broken only by labored breathing. The paramedics exchanged glances. Something wasn't right. One of them immediately began working on John, stabilizing him, while another radioed in for police assistance. But even before officers arrived, things didn't add up. The alley was too clean. A violent attack should have left signs, overturned trash bins, scuffed footprints, a trail of blood leading somewhere, but there was nothing. No footprints heading away from the scene. No evidence of a struggle. No signs that a third person had ever been there. And yet, Mark stuck to his story. A man in black, he ran. But the more they looked at the crime scene, the more obvious it became. There was no mystery attacker. The only two people in that alley were John and Mark. And John wasn't saying a word. John was slipping away. His breathing was slow, uneven, each shallow gasp weaker than the last. The paramedics worked quickly, pressing down on his wounds, their voices calm but urgent. But something was wrong. Most victims in his condition would be screaming, crying, begging for help. The shock, the pain, it should have sent his body into a frenzy, his survival instincts kicking in. But John didn't fight. He didn't flinch when pressure was applied to his chest. He didn't wince when his body was shifted. He didn't even acknowledge Mark, who stood just feet away, watching in horror. He wasn't acting like a boy who had just been attacked. He was acting like a boy who had been waiting for this moment. The paramedics tried to talk to him. "Can you hear me? Who did this to you?" John's eyelids fluttered, his gaze distant, but still he said nothing. No accusations, no fear, no confusion. It was as if he already knew exactly how this night was supposed to play out. And that made no sense. Hours later, in the bright white sterility of a hospital room, John lay motionless, his skin pale, his arms lined with yves. His heartbeat was steady now, his body stabilizing. Detectives had been waiting, watching. John had barely spoken a word since he was found, but they needed answers. When his eyes finally opened, the room went silent. A detective stepped forward. "John, do you know who did this to you?" For a long moment, he just stared at the ceiling as if debating whether or not to respond. Then, finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered. It was him. The detective frowned. "Who?" John turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the boy sitting in an interrogation room down the hall. "Mark." It should have been a simple case. The victim had named his attacker. Mark had been found at the scene. The bloody knife had been in his hands. But then, before the detective could even process the relief of a confession, John added something else. Something no victim had ever said before. "But I asked him to." The room went still. The detective's pen, hovering above his notepad, froze in place. "What did you just say?" "I asked him to," John repeated. His voice was weak, but his tone was calm, too calm. The detective looked to the nurse as if needing someone to confirm he had heard correctly. John wasn't just identifying his attacker. He was admitting that the stabbing had been planned. But why? Why would a 14-year-old orchestrate his own near death? And more importantly, how had he convinced Mark to go through with it? A boy orchestrating his own murder. It made no sense. Detectives sat in stunned silence after hearing John's words. They had seen cases of manipulation, of deception, of teenagers caught in dangerous situations, but never this. Why would a 14-year-old go to such lengths to arrange his own violent attack? Suicide attempts were tragically common, but this wasn't a desperate act of self-harm. This was something else. John hadn't tried to take his own life. He had planned it. He had manipulated someone else into doing it for him. But why? Detectives knew there had to be more, and when they started digging, searching through chat logs, emails, online accounts, they uncovered a truth so disturbing, so twisted, that it seemed impossible. Because John had never been alone in this plan. There had been someone else, someone in his ear, someone who had pushed this entire thing forward. And that person didn't exist. It all started online. Months before the stabbing, 16-year-old Mark met a girl in a Manchester teen chat room. Her name was Rachel West. She was everything a lonely teenager could hope for. Funny, sweet, smart, beautiful. And most importantly, she liked him. For the first time in his life, Mark felt important, wanted. Rachel would message him late at night, telling him he was special, that he was different from other guys, that she trusted him in a way she had never trusted anyone before. They talked about everything: life, school, their dreams. Mark was falling for her, and every time he logged on, he wanted more. But then Rachel told him something that changed everything. She had a secret, a dark, dangerous truth that she could only share with him. And the moment she told him, Mark's life would never be the same again. Rachel West was perfect, too perfect. She always seemed to say exactly what Mark needed to hear. When he felt insecure, she reassured him. When he was lonely, she was there. She never missed a message, never took too long to reply. And then, one night, she introduced him to someone else, her stepbrother. He was older, wiser, someone who had seen things Mark couldn't even imagine. He told Mark that Rachel was in trouble, that there were things happening behind the scenes that she couldn't talk about. Then another person entered the chat, Janet Dobinson. Janet wasn't just anyone. She claimed to be a high-ranking agent with MI5, the British intelligence service, and she had news that would change Mark's life forever. She told him he was chosen, that he had a role to play in something much bigger than himself, that he was going to be a part of a mission. And Mark, he believed every word. But there was one problem. None of them were real. Rachel, the stepbrother, Janet Dobinson, they were all John. The same boy who now lay in a hospital bed recovering from the stabbing he had planned for himself. For months, John had played mind games with Mark, spinning an intricate web of lies so detailed, so perfectly executed, that Mark never questioned a thing. He controlled everything. Rachel made Mark feel special. Janet made Mark feel important. The mission made Mark feel like he had a purpose. It was psychological warfare, and Mark never stood a chance. Little by little, John rewired his best friend's reality. At first, the tasks were small. Prove you're loyal. Walk past this place and tell me what you see. Write a message and leave it at a bus stop. Each one designed to deepen Mark's belief in the mission, each one making it harder for him to step away. Until finally, the test of ultimate loyalty came, and Mark was given an order, a kill order. It all started small, harmless, a test. Janet had called it. Walk past this street, tell me what you see. Mark followed the instructions without hesitation, scanning his surroundings like a spy in training. A normal road, a few parked cars, nothing unusual. He reported back. Janet praised him. Good, you're paying attention. The missions continued. Leave a note at a bus stop. Watch for a man in a red jacket, don't let him see you. Send me a coded message using only numbers. They were thrilling, a game with real stakes. Mark felt chosen. He felt trusted. But more than that, he felt needed. Janet, the high-ranking My-5 agent, confided in him, told him how dangerous the world was, how few people could be relied on. You're special, Mark. We can only trust you. And then, one night, she gave him a truth that changed everything. A revelation so shocking, so dangerous, that it left Mark breathless. Rachel was in danger. The words appeared on Mark's screen, simple but chilling. Someone close to you is a traitor. Mark's pulse quickened. His mind raced through possibilities. Who? Someone you trust. No, it couldn't be. It's John. Mark froze. John, his best friend, his only real friend, Janet explained. John was a risk. He had been compromised. If he talked, Rachel would die. Mark's stomach churned. You have one chance to prove your loyalty, Janet told him. The mission was clear. The stakes were high. Kill John. And Mark, he believed every word. June 29th, 2003. A warm summer night. The streets were quiet. Most of the town was asleep. But in a deserted alley, two boys stood face to face. Mark's hands were slick with sweat, his grip unsteady as he held the knife. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His breath was uneven, his body screaming at him to turn back. This wasn't who he was. He wasn't a killer. But Janet had told him this was a mission, a final test of loyalty, the ultimate sacrifice to prove he was ready. John, just 14 years old, stood motionless. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He didn't even flinch. He just waited. Mark hesitated. This isn't real. This can't be real. But Janet's words rang in his head. If you don't do this, Rachel will die. Mark clenched his teeth. His hand tightened around the handle of the knife. And then he stepped forward. In one swift motion, he drove the blade into John's chest. For a second, time froze. Mark's breathing hitched. His hand trembled as he pulled the knife back, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. John staggered. A dark stain spread across his shirt. His body wavered slightly. Mark braced himself for the reaction. The scream, the panic, the fight for survival. But it never came. John didn't scream. He didn't cry out. He didn't even try to run. Instead, he looked down at the wound, then ever so slightly. He smiled. Mark felt his stomach drop. This wasn't right. John should have fought. He should have collapsed, screaming in agony, begging for help. But instead, he stood there, as if he had wanted this. Mark could only watch, frozen in horror, as John slowly crumpled to the ground, his breathing shallow, his pulse fading. And in that moment, Mark realized this wasn't just a mission. It was a trap, one he had walked straight into. Mark stood frozen. John was on the ground, blood pooling beneath him, his breathing weak. His eyes fluttered, his lips parting slightly as if trying to say something. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. Call for help now. But then he remembered Janet's instructions. Don't call 911 right away. Wait for my signal. Mark's fingers twitched over his phone. Every second felt like an eternity. What if the mission wasn't over? What if Janet still had something planned? He stared at John, watching his best friend slip further away. And still he hesitated, because Janet had told him to wait. Minutes passed. John's breaths grew shallower, his body weaker. And then, finally, Mark broke. His hands shaking, he dialed the emergency number. His voice was panicked, his words stumbling over each other. My friend, he's been stabbed. He's bleeding. I don't know what to do. When paramedics arrived, John was barely clinging to life. His skin had turned pale, his pulse faint. Mark stepped back, his face ghostly white as he watched them work to save John. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the weight of what he had done finally sank in. He had almost killed his best friend for a mission that never existed. At first, Mark's story seemed simple enough. A mugging, a random attack, a man in black. But as detectives examined the scene, things weren't adding up. The alley was too clean. No overturned trash bins, no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away. Where was the attacker's escape route? Where was the evidence of this so-called man in black? Detectives pressed Mark for details, but his answers were shaky. I don't know. I didn't get a good look at him. They didn't buy it. Something wasn't right. So they seized Mark's computer. And what they found changed everything. They expected messages between teenagers. What they discovered was a web of deception so twisted, so layered, that it defied belief. Because every single person Mark had spoken to Rachel West, her stepbrother, Janet Dobinson, had never existed. They were all John, the same boy who now lay in a hospital bed, recovering from the attack he had orchestrated himself. The interrogation room was silent except for the steady clicking of a keyboard. A detective scrolled through an endless stream of messages, text after text, an intricate web of deception unfolding on the screen. It was all there. The conversations between Mark and Rachel West fake. The orders from Janet Dobinson, the My5 agent fake. The warnings from Rachel's stepbrother fake. Every single person Mark had trusted, confided in, risked everything for, had never existed. Detectives leaned in, their faces grim as they processed what they were seeing. One by one, the messages painted a picture so disturbing, so calculated, that it hardly seemed possible. John, just 14 years old, had spent months creating an entire world out of nothing. Different accounts, different personalities, different voices, all carefully tailored to manipulate one person, Mark. And the most chilling part, it had worked. John had convinced his best friend to kill him. Not out of anger, not out of hate, but because Mark truly believed it was his mission. The detectives glanced at each other, the weight of the discovery settling in. This wasn't just a case of online deception. This was something much, much darker. Why? That was the question that haunted detectives the most. Why would John do this? Was it a twisted game, a psychological experiment? Had he wanted to die, or was it something far more sinister? Interrogators asked him directly, "John, why did you manipulate your friend into stabbing you?" He didn't answer. He just stared at them, his expression unreadable. They tried again. "Were you testing him, seeing how far you could push him?" Still no response. Detectives weren't sure if they were looking at a deeply troubled teenager or a master manipulator in the making. Had he always planned for the truth to be uncovered? Or had he believed deep down that he wouldn't survive the attack? One thing was clear: John had controlled everything. And Mark, he had never stood a chance. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, their pens scratching against their notepads, cameras flashing as the two boys, Mark and John, were led inside. Two teenagers, both victims, both perpetrators. Mark had stabbed his best friend. That was undeniable. The evidence was there: the knife, the confession, the crime scene. But John had orchestrated it. He had manipulated every detail, created a world of deception so airtight that Mark believed he had no choice but to follow through. So, what did justice look like in a case like this? The prosecution went after Mark first. He was charged with attempted murder. The facts were simple: he had stabbed John. He had waited before calling for help. He had nearly killed his best friend. But then came the part that left everyone speechless. John, the victim, wasn't just a victim. He had created the plot. He had manipulated Mark into believing that killing him was a mission, an act of loyalty that would save lives. And so, John was charged with something no one had ever seen before: inciting his own murder. A crime so bizarre, so legally unprecedented, that even the most seasoned lawyers struggled to process it. Two boys, one case. And then came the moment no one saw coming. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent. Neither of them would go to prison. Mark, who had nearly taken a life, and John, who had masterminded his own near death, were both given supervision orders. They would be monitored, watched, restricted. But the real punishment: they were never allowed to speak to each other again. Not in person, not online, not ever. The judge's decision was clear. This relationship is too dangerous to continue. Two teenagers who had once been best friends, inseparable, now forced apart by a crime that never should have happened. But even as the case closed, one question lingered. Had justice really been served? Or had both boys simply walked away from something far more dangerous than anyone realized? The case didn't end in the courtroom. It became something much bigger, a worldwide obsession. Journalists dissected every detail, true crime authors analyzed the psychology behind it, and the internet couldn't stop talking about it. How did a 14-year-old manage to manipulate an entire reality? How could a boy so young create an intelligence operation so convincing that someone was willing to kill for it? People were fascinated, horrified, obsessed. The story was turned into books, podcasts, and ultimately a movie. You Want Me to Kill Him, a dramatized version of the case exploring the dark corners of online deception, psychological manipulation, and the terrifying power of belief. But even after all the analysis, all the expert opinions, there was no clear answer. Was John a genius manipulator, or was he a troubled child caught in his own web of lies? Even now, no one knows for sure. And now, the most haunting questions of all. Did John truly want to die? Or was this just a test of his own power? If Mark had succeeded, if John had died in that alley, would we have ever uncovered the truth? Or would we have all believed the lie? And the scariest question of all, how many others are out there right now, capable of doing the same thing? Because if John could manipulate reality so perfectly, who's to say someone else isn't doing it right now? The end.